Well, hello everyone. I'd like to talk today about some of my personal experiences over the last couple of years during the COVID-19 pandemic. And in particular, I want to share how I think the growth of collaborative networks over this period of time as a result of the pandemic has probably contributed to the future of our field. Now, as we all know, the pandemic has disrupted global activities and has resulted in pretty unimaginable loss of human life. Just in our own field of coral reef restoration science, it's presented many challenges. There are nurseries to maintain, outplanting targets to be met, monitoring data to be collected. However, the rapid growth of video conferencing technology as a result of the pandemic has also, to my mind, led us to a really striking period of sustained communication and thought exchange. And these networks and meetings have resulted in a huge amount of collaborative thought exchange. And although this process of sharing information and forming networks had begun at least a couple of years earlier with, for example, the Coral Restoration Consortium of 2016 to 17, the Reef Futures meeting of 2018 and the National Academy of Sciences reports of 2019, I think the pandemic really accelerated communication and creativity around these topics, even if it slowed direct implementation progress. And in the US and Florida in particular, the pandemic also coincided with several somewhat unique funding opportunities that tended to promote the formation of large interdisciplinary teams. And although there are many examples of this, I thought I would describe how one or two of these teams assembled and how, as a result of pandemic lockdown, these larger funding opportunities really saw quite a period of unprecedented information exchange. And so the examples I will draw upon start back in 2018 when the University of Miami's ULink program funded a relatively small group of investigators to begin to investigate hybrid reef structures and build coastal resilience in Miami. And this led to a proposal to the National Coastal Resilience Fund to build the network and establish what we call the Southeastern Florida Coral Reef Restoration Hub, consisting of 9 investigators across 5 institutions. And then with support from Florida Department of Environmental Protection's Coral Protection and Restoration Program, the hub then grew to include 14 investigators from 6 institutions. And this hub, the Southeast Florida Coral Reef Restoration Hub, led to some really sort of unanticipated projects that evolved very organically and were able to respond pretty quickly to new opportunities. For example, a relatively conventional NSF-funded research team that was investigating the relative ease with which different coral species could change their algal symbiont communities and how that might be implemented in a restoration context. It actually ended up sort of evolving as a result of connections through the hub and through other networks like the Disease Advisory Committee into a second team that was interested in the role of symbionts in the susceptibility of corals to Skittle D, stony coral tissue loss disease. And again, as a result of the hub connections, that group then joined a third team that translated this work to coral larvae, who were also applying sperm cryopreservation to work with a fourth team on field-based coral reproduction, which then allowed them to breed corals for resistance to stony coral tissue loss disease by working with a fifth team that were using new aquarium-based technology to induce spawning of corals that had been rescued ahead of the skittled outbreak. And I think this is a really good example of how larger research networks that self-assemble have the potential to achieve much more than the sum of their individual parts. And I think this has to do with synergies in collaborative team science that are generally undervalued. More recently, a new funding opportunity from a Department of Defense program called Reef, which was managed by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, has led to a new team called Reefs, writing a proposal that leveraged the connections from the existing hub and adding more team members. So now 29 investigators from 12 different institutions to develop and trial advanced hybrid reef structures. And in this example, which is still just at the proposal stage, hasn't been funded yet, coastal engineers working with one of the world's largest wind wave simulators are designing innovative structural designs for artificial reef structures that incorporate novel materials. And then those engineers are then working with material scientists and ecologists who are proposing new ways to deter algal overgrowth, enhance recruitment, and accelerate coral growth on these advanced structures. And then these teams are working with coral biologists who are interested in developing and testing ways to increase the thermal tolerance and disease resistance of corals that are outplanted or seeded to these structures. And together, the overall goal of these teams is to develop, test, and implement a hybrid green-gray infrastructure, a coral reef designed to maximize wave attenuation at minimal cost, while also being self-repairing, fast-growing, and resilient to future climate projections. And I think the connections and collaborative opportunities are ubiquitous across large networks of researchers. And I think this is due to the relative ease with which new connections can be made. The examples I just described are just one of many different sort of project evolutionary pathways I could probably have described among various different partners. I just described the ones that I'm closest to. But what I think these experiences suggest to me is that there's lots of synergies that arise from the economies of scale and network connections that characterize these larger teams. And I think this has to do with the volume of often interdisciplinary information that is being communicated across the network. And I think that results in the activation energy, if you like, for establishing a new collaboration or a new project idea is much less when the projects are already networked in other ways. And what this figure shows is a network diagram of all of the investigators in the DARPA Reef's proposal, and illustrates all the connections that exist among members that have already worked together on a project or a paper, as well as a number of sort of new team members with new connections, new ideas, new opportunities. And I think this combination of established relationships and new collaborations is actually a great model to build from. So consequently, establishing large teams to collaboratively solve more complex problems may be more effective than supporting individual investigators to address more straightforward questions. Why is this important? Well, the scale of coral restoration and intervention problem is so great that we really have no time to waste. It's unlikely that there will be a one-size-fits-all solution to the threats corals face. And if we need to be investigating as many different ideas as possible, then large teams that can trial new approaches off the backs of existing projects are much more suited to then seek funding for ideas that already show promise in ways that smaller teams really can't do very effectively. And I think, moreover, large coral reef science and restoration networks also help foster a kind of a shared camaraderie of hope that sustains and inspires its members. And I love this quote: "Hope is like a road in the country. There was never a road, but when many people walk on it, the road comes into existence." I think, put more prosaically, doom and gloom won't save the world, as Nancy Knowlton has suggested, and talking about our successes is how we learn to expand them. Ultimately, I think our shared pandemic experience may have unexpectedly helped establish communication and team building practices that will help us confront the growing crisis facing reefs. So I'd just like to end by thanking all the various team members who are part of my own Camaraderie of Hope, the Southeast Florida Coral Restoration Hub, all the team members in the DARPA Reefs proposal, which, even if the project's not eventually funded, has already led to some great new ideas and collaborations, and of course, my own lab at the University of Miami, without whom quite literally none of the actual work would get done. And finally, I'd also like to flag several other networks that have contributed to the overall message that I'm trying to convey today: the Genetics Working Group of the Coral Restoration Consortium, led by Ileana Baums, the Florida Palmata Coordination Group, led by Jennifer Moore, and the huge Disease Advisory Committee that has met more or less monthly throughout the pandemic, led by Mauricio Martinelli and Tori Barker. And finally, last but not least, I'd like to also acknowledge the Pew Fellows group of Les Kaufman, Bob Richmond, and Steve Palumbi, who to me really epitomize the spirit of camaraderie that I've tried to convey here. I'll take questions now if there are any. Thanks.